$45,000. That is what Deepak Menon made in 90 days. The first trade took 11 seconds. He clicked the button on a Tuesday afternoon in his office at the Institute, then sat very still and watched the number move. He was a research professor at the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research in Mumbai. He had not planned to make that money. He had planned to prove the market had a pattern, and that he had found it. $270,000. That was the number in his account 6 months after the first trade. His wife Sunita believed it was a research grant disbursement. He let her believe that. $450,000. That was what disappeared. Not all at once. Over 8 months. Some of it was money he had saved for 20 years. Some of it was money he had borrowed without telling anyone. Some of it was money set aside for his daughter's university. The laptop was open on the kitchen table at 3 a.m. Deepak had fallen asleep in the chair beside it. The screen was still on. The numbers were still running. Sunita found it before he woke up. Deepak Menon had spent 10 years as a research professor at the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research in Gurgaon, Mumbai. His published work on market behavior had been cited in policy documents by the Reserve Bank of India. He had advised 3 government committees on retail investor protection. He had written a paper, widely read in academic circles, on the psychological patterns that cause ordinary people to keep losing money in financial markets long after the evidence has told them to stop. He was not a man anyone expected to find inside that paper. Growing up in Chennai, he had been the kind of student teachers remembered long after the semester ended. His father drove a municipal bus on the same route for 31 years. His mother kept a small notebook of household expenses locked in the kitchen drawer, updated every evening after dinner. Numbers had always been the way out of the place he was born into, and Deepak had understood that before he was old enough to explain it. He studied hard, got the scholarship, became the researcher, built the life that proved the numbers right. By 2025, he had tenure, a daughter who had inherited his relationship with numbers, and a Lakeview apartment in Powai. Enough, by any reasonable measure. He had everything that was supposed to be enough. And something in him had been asking, for longer than he admitted, whether enough was all there was. The volatility started in January of 2025. A policy announcement from the Reserve Bank caught most analysts off guard. Deepak watched the Nifty 50 move in exactly the direction his own models had predicted 3 days earlier. He had written that prediction in a working paper. 2 colleagues had read it and said nothing. Nobody had done anything with it. That evening, he sat in his office longer than usual. The cleaning staff came through, switched off the corridor lights, and left. He opened his laptop, searched for something, closed the browser, opened it again. Then he opened a trading account for the first time. He told himself it was field research, a way to test whether the behavioral patterns he had studied for a decade held under real conditions with real money. That was the reason he gave himself, and it was not entirely untrue, but underneath it was something else. In 10 years of research, no journal had ever told Deepak Menon he was wrong about markets. His peers cited him. His institute director praised his work in annual reviews. He had spent a decade being confirmed by people whose job required them to take his conclusions seriously. The market was the first thing in his professional life that did not know his name. $45,000 in 90 days. When he saw that number, he did not call anyone. He sat with it alone in his office for a long time, and what he felt was not satisfaction. It was recognition. The market had looked at what he knew and said yes. And that yes felt different from any grant approval or peer review or institutional commendation he had ever received. It felt honest. He started trading every morning before his first meeting. He did not know yet that the market never says yes forever. April of 2025. The Reserve Bank announced an emergency rate decision on a Thursday morning. Deepak had a long position open, a large one, and it moved against him within 40 minutes. By noon, he had lost $60,000. He sat at his desk between meetings and stared at the number. The number does not move. It just sits there. Then he opened a new position that afternoon. Not because there was a signal, because he needed the market to correct what it had done to him before the day ended. The new position was 3 times larger than anything he had placed before. He told himself it was a calibrated response. In his own published paper, the one cited by the Reserve Bank, he had described this exact behavior and named it revenge trading. He had written that it was among the most reliable early indicators of catastrophic account loss. He had presented that finding at a conference in Singapore 2 years earlier to a room of 200 people. He placed the order at 2:43 in the afternoon. Sunita called at 6 in the evening and asked when he was coming home. He said he had a paper deadline. The position was still open. He could not close it with the number still against him. If he closed it, the loss became permanent. If the loss became permanent, the market had been right and he had been wrong. So he stayed. That was the first lie. It did not feel like a lie at the time. It felt like a delay. He would go home as soon as the position resolved. He would explain everything once the number corrected. He had explained complex things clearly. His whole career. He would find the right words when the moment came. The number did not correct that evening. He drove home at 10, with the position still running. He ate reheated dinner at the kitchen table and helped Diya with her statistics homework and did not look at his phone once. Sunita watched him from the other side of the table. He did not notice. Tuesday, minus 8,000. Wednesday, minus 11. Friday, minus 4. Each loss made the next session non-negotiable. Each session was the one that would correct the previous one. By Sunday night, he had stopped checking the total. The account that had reached $270,000 was now below $150,000 and still falling. He kept the figures in a small notebook stored inside a research folder on his desk. He told himself it was data collection. He began restructuring his days. A colleague from the institute stopped him in the corridor to ask about a joint paper they had been working on for 4 months. Deepak answered without slowing down. He did not remember the conversation. 15 minutes later. By the time he reached his office, the market had already opened. Institute commitments were rescheduled around market hours. He traded from 6 in the morning until the session opened, then again through lunch, then again after Diya went to bed. He was not hiding it. He had simply not yet found the right moment to explain it. There was always an open position that needed resolving first. One evening, Diya came out of her room at 11 with a printed form in her hand. Her school had a field trip to the Bandra Kurla Complex Financial District the following morning. She had forgotten to get the permission slip signed. She stood at the door of his study and apologized for interrupting. Deepak held out his hand without looking up from the screen. She placed the form in it. He signed where the line was and handed it back. She said thank you and went to bed. The light in her room went off. Sunita was standing in the hallway. She had been watching for longer than he knew. She said nothing. She went back to their bedroom and closed the door. He looked down at his hand for a moment. He had not read a single word on that form. He did not know where his daughter was going in the morning, what time the bus left, or who her emergency contact was listed as. The screen was still open in front of him. The position was still running. He turned back to it. That was the moment he could have stopped. He knows that now. But stopping would have meant accepting that the man who had just signed his daughter's permission form without reading, it was the same man who had published 10 years of work on exactly this kind of blindness. He could not hold both of those things at once, so he held the position instead. By June, the personal savings account was empty. The family emergency fund followed in late June. In late July, he logged into the account Diya's grandparents had started for her when she was born. 17 years of deposits. He transferred the full balance to his trading account. The confirmation screen asked for a reason for transfer. He typed education. Then he deleted it and typed nothing. He did not tell Sunita. He calculated that he needed 1 strong week. The mathematics were straightforward. 1 strong week and everything would return to where it had been before April. He had modeled recoveries like this in research. He understood the mechanics. The market did not give him that week. The laptop was open on the kitchen table at 3 a.m. Deepak had fallen asleep in the chair. His head was to one side. The screen had not gone dark because a live chart was still running. Sunita had gotten up for water. She stood at the kitchen counter for a moment before she turned and saw the table. The screen was the only light in the room. She could see the account balance. She could see the list of trades going back months. She could see the dates. And she began doing the arithmetic quietly in her head, matching the dates against things she now remembered differently. The research grant that had never appeared in their joint account. The emergency fund she had checked once in March and not thought about since. The conversation about Diya's university application that Deepak had kept postponing. A small photograph was taped to the corner of the laptop screen. The 3 of them in Goa the previous December. Diya, in a yellow dress standing at the edge of the water. Sunita, with her arm around Deepak. Everyone was smiling. The kettle she had boiled before bed was still on the stove. It had gone cold. She did not wake him. She went back to bed. In the morning, she placed his coffee on the table the way she did every morning. She sat down across from him. She waited until he looked up. Then she asked one question: how much is left? He told her the number. He did not look away when he said it. She sat with that for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. Diya was still asleep down the hall. Then she asked about Diya's university fund. He did not answer. She stood up and went to the window. She looked out at the lake. He watched her back and understood that the silence was not anger. It was something more final than anger. The kind of quiet that arrives when a person has absorbed something too large to respond to immediately, and is deciding not which words to use, but whether words are the right instrument at all. When she finally turned around, her face was the face of someone who had already made several decisions without him. The way people make decisions when they understand they have been alone in something far longer than they knew. She asked one more question. Does anyone at the Institute know? He said no. She nodded. Then she went to wake Diya for school. Deepak sat at the kitchen table until he heard the front door close. The apartment was quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. He opened the laptop. The position from the night before was still running. He looked at it for a long time. His hand moved toward the keyboard and stopped. He closed the laptop instead. He went to his 9 a.m. seminar. He stood in front of 14 doctoral students and led a session on behavioral biases in financial decision-making. He covered loss aversion. He covered escalating commitment. He covered the research showing that the more a person knows about a bias, the more susceptible they sometimes become to it, because knowledge creates the illusion of immunity. The students discussed. One of them cited his own paper back to him. He listened and did not say anything extra. On the way out, a doctoral student stopped him and said it was the most useful session of the semester. Deepak thanked him and walked to his office. He sat down. He closed the door. He reached into his bag and took out the photograph from Goa. He had removed it from the laptop before the seminar. He set it on the desk in front of him. He did not turn it face down. He sat there for a long time without opening his laptop. 6 weeks after the conference, I met Deepak Menon in a small conference room at the Institute, the very room where he had presented his research on investor psychology to a visiting delegation from the Treasury Department. He arrived early. He had already ordered water for both of us. I did not ask about the trades. I did not ask about the money or the positions. I asked him what he had been looking for before he opened the account. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said,
I had spent a decade studying why people cannot stop. I had the language for it. I had the data. I had sat in conference rooms and explained the mechanism to policymakers and fund managers and journalists.
He picked up the glass of water and set it back down.
And I had confused understanding the mechanism with being outside it. The market was the first honest room I had ever been in. I could not leave it, even after it started taking things I could not recover, because leaving meant admitting that the man who had written the paper was inside the paper. That I had not been studying other people. I had been studying myself without knowing it.
I asked him when he first understood that the trading had nothing to do with money. He said,
The night Diya brought me a permission slip to sign, I signed it without reading it. I did not know where my daughter was going the next morning, and I noticed that. I noticed it clearly. But the position was still open, and I turned back to it. The thing I was protecting was not money. It was the version of myself that was still right, and I could not let go of that version, even after everything else had already gone. That was the last thing I let go of. That was the most expensive thing.
I asked him what the market actually took from him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said,
The certainty. For my entire career, I had been certain about one thing, that I understood how people lose. The market did not take my money first. It took that. And once that was gone, the money followed easily.
I asked him what Sunita said to him that night, after Diya went to sleep, after everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said,
She did not say anything. That was the worst part. She had already said everything she needed to say when she asked me how much was left. After that, there was nothing left to say. I think that was the moment that I understood I had not lost money. I had lost the right to be trusted with anything that mattered.
On the table in front of him, his phone was face down. It had been face down the entire time. Deepak still works at the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research. The trading account has been closed for 7 months. He and Sunita are repaying the debt in installments that will take 4 years. Diya does not know. That was the one decision they made together, without needing to discuss it. He comes home before 8 most evenings. They eat dinner together. Some nights, after Diya goes to bed, he and Sunita sit at the kitchen table and talk for an hour. Not about money, about other things. The laptop is still on the kitchen table. The screen goes dark by 9. Sometimes he opens a market app and looks at the prices. He does not place trades. He looks for a minute, sometimes 2, then puts the phone down. The time between opening it and putting it down has been getting shorter. He does not think recovered is the right word for what is happening. What is happening is smaller than that. He wakes up in the morning, and the first thought is not about a position. Most mornings. The institute starts at 9. He is usually there by then. Most days. Deepak Menon did not lose his money to the market. He lost it to the version of himself that could not be wrong. That version does not trade anymore. It sits at the kitchen table and talks about other things. Most evenings. This is one of many stories like this. I am Maya V. Wealth, the host of Wealth Paradox Global. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the market explains it to them directly. Subscribe to Wealth Paradox Global for more stories like this one, like this video, if you recognize something in Deepak that you have seen somewhere before. And leave a comment. What are you still opening, even when you already know what it costs?